In our lives, actions, and obligations, moral clarity matters. Given that the essence of moral thought is to address and ameliorate human suffering and to expand human freedoms, how can we afford not to attend to moral clarity when it comes to international relief and development? The Center for Values in International Development seeks to apply the insights, analytical frameworks, knowledge, and experience that already exist within the field of international development ethics to guide relief and development practice. We continue the dialogue with our second of 5 conversations with today's focus on inclusive development as part of the Center's Ethical Development Series, building an effective bridge between the practitioners community and the ethicists community to the mutual benefit of both and to the significant improvement in the effectiveness of international relief and development. With me is Dr. Ravi Verma and Dr. Serene Khader. Serene holds the Jay Newman Chair in Philosophy of Culture at Brooklyn College and is a professor of philosophy and women's and gender studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. Her most recent book, Decolonizing Universalism, a Transnational Feminist Ethic, asks what values should guide transnational feminist solidarity. And she is currently writing a book entitled The Freedom Myth, about why we need to stop thinking feminism's core value is freedom and start thinking it's equality. Serene is joined by Ravi Verma, who is Asia Director of the International Center for Research on Women and leads local regional efforts on numerous issues, including reproductive health, family planning, preventing domestic violence and child marriage, engaging men and boys to empower women, and economic development. And my name is Evan Papp, and I'm the moderator and producer for this series of ethical discussions for the Center for Values in International Development. Thank you, Serene and Ravi, for participating in this discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
I will be addressing questions to both of you, but this is a conversation, so feel free to address each other's comments. So without further ado, let's begin. How do you understand the term inclusive development, and why is development that is inclusive important for the practice of international development? Serene, could we begin with you?
Thanks, Evan. I'm so glad to be here with both you and Ravi. I think a simple way of understanding inclusive development is as development that allows every person in a society to equally participate in determining what counts as development and to benefit from the process of development. And one thing I think that's very important to understand about that is, because I'm a philosopher, right? Equality, like when I say that everybody has an equal right to participate in designing development, thinking about what counts as development, and that they have an equal right to benefit, is that equality is like what philosophers will call like a relational value. And so that means that we can't, like, equality always has, like, we're always comparing how two people are doing or how two groups of people are doing. So part of what that means, and you're going to hear a lot of versions of this, I think, in my answers today, but is that creating equitable or inclusive development is not always or only accomplished through making interventions in the lives of people who are already disadvantaged, right? Sometimes the way to give people who have been marginalized or disadvantaged access to defining development and access to the benefits of development is to change what people who are in advantaged groups are doing. So I'm sure, Ravi's work is so much about this, but a simple example is that sometimes in order to change how, whether women are like a part of inclusive development, one of the things we need to look at is what men are doing. And sometimes that is a better way to bring about more inclusive development for women than just going straight to doing something for women in isolation. But big picture, I think inclusive development is giving everybody in the society the opportunity to participate in defining development and benefiting from it. And this contrasts with some earlier approaches to development that I'm sure people are familiar with, but for example, that include assuming that economic growth just benefits everybody without looking at how it might actually produce increased inequality or leave some people out. It also contrasts with approaches to development that suggest that we already know what development is and what the goals of development should be. Instead, inclusive development says that people's own visions, including especially marginalized people's own visions of what a better life for them looks like, ought to play a role in shaping what development looks like.
Thank you, Serene and Ravi.
Well, I thank you, Serene, for so nicely articulating this idea of inclusive development. I couldn't agree with you more that it is oftentimes not only about um, marginalized communities, it is about larger structures and the fact that the structures do ensure equity in the process of inclusive development. It should not be uh, a rhetoric where only people identified and labeled as someone who needs to be included in development as a matter of top down uh, uh, ideas or the package of uh, inclusion. It is something that needs to be owned up by everyone and all those who have been on the margins of development. So it is primarily, in my view, creating opportunities, ensuring that there is access, and ensuring that this entire process is owned by those who have remained on the margins. So equity, social justice clearly defines the idea of inclusive development.
Thank you both. Moving on to the next question. When setting development policy and programming priorities, people and groups who are marginalized and vulnerable have little or no voice. How can the voices and the humanity of the marginalized and vulnerable be elevated, understood, and responded to?
Well, this is quite a struggle to engage and and hear the voices and the concerns of communities and people who are marginalized. Uh, the methodology that we have, the tools that we use in the development paradigms often do not really permit us um, to shift that ownership. And I think we have always been hearing and we have been practicing in some ways to ensure that they the communities become part of the process of thinking through their own priorities and having their own concerns expressed in the process. But somewhere down the line we often find that the solutions within the quotes are predetermined, predisposed. There is always and I think it relates to the fact that uh, the participation of those voices are always in conflict with those who have the dominant voices and the ones who have a much greater stakes in the maintenance of status quo. And as a result, um, the if the ownership and the participation of those voices have to become the uh, uh, major paradigm of this development, then there has to be a genuine soul searching by those who think that they are in command of developing others. I mean, that itself is very presumptive that I am the one who can develop you. And I think uh, the uh, and that's where the power equation just gets set in the process. So I'm just simply reflecting on this entire issue of representing their voices is easily said than done unless we recognize those vested interests and the unwritten hidden kind of agenda of the development and are made explicit. So that's why ethics and transparency and accountabilities are important part of ensuring voices. Um and it's not done in short-term project mode. It is done as long-term commitment to these issues.
I love what you said, Ravi, and I was just wondering if maybe do you want to give an example of the type of thing that you're talking about? Because I think the audience might really benefit from hearing an example.
the thing that is very clear to me is the set of programs that go on the name of health, especially within the sector of health, and how health is defined is so medicalized and technical and jargonized that it has still it is technocratic, a large part of it, and it benefits the powerful groups of those who are benefiting from having a larger health agenda which is downstream oriented. And we have not yet seen within the health sector a genuine reflection of gender um, issues. Gender and health has truly not come together, um, or the health sector has not really imbibed the gender framework in a mainstream manner. And I'll give you an example of how during the COVID time we have been tracking the disaggregated data from 197 countries for last about 1.5 year, and countries after countries we have seen that they have not presented the data, sex disaggregated data, on the spectrum of COVID infection, right from the identification of cases to the hospitalization to deaths to vaccinations. There are very few countries, and I'm using the word sex very deliberately because whatever data if you whatever data we have on this sex disaggregated, if you look at that data within different context, you find that sometimes women are more women are infected than men, and sometimes you find more men are infected than women, depending on how the roles and the patriarchal norms get played out in those contexts, who becomes vulnerable for what reasons. But in the absence of that, even the basic biological information about sex disaggregation does not allow us to interpret the gender dynamics of how the other drivers are marginalizing or accentuating the vulnerabilities to both men and women and other gender. And forget about the other genders. There's no data by other aspects on the gender spectrum. It's just men and women itself. We don't get data disaggregated by this.
Yeah, I think that was extremely helpful. Thank you. My answer is very in line with Ravi's, about kind of like when Ravi mentioned the importance of soul searching on the part of people who could conceive themselves as the developers, right? Like, I was going to initially answer by saying this question makes me grumpy a little bit. The question that says, like, the marginalized have no voice. I'm like, well, this is like, it's grumpy because it's like, well, do they have no voice or are people not listening to them? Because I think it's very easy, and kind of with what I was saying about relationships before, like maybe we could say, like, really having a voice, it partly means being able to analyze your situation for yourself and being able to speak out. But it also means that other people are taking up your voice. And so, we have had now, I mean, 60 or some years of criticism of mainstream development, of people saying that the participation of local people is not taken seriously. So I think it's a little bit, not to say that there are no people who are voiceless, but it is a little bit strange to say that the problem is only that marginalized people don't have a voice. Like, the problem is often a lack of uptake on behalf of people, even I think in this generation, who think that they are advocates of participatory development, right? Like, they know to say that word, but like, what does it really mean to listen? And I think part of the soul searching that we need to see is, well, like, what are the disconnects that are allowing practitioners to say that they are advocates of participatory development, but still not really be listening? And I think there's a lot of kind of different things we could point to there. One that I think Ravi already pointed to is technocracy and like the idea of expertise. Like, especially like when we're watching, like we're in this era of development where we're watching lots of technocratic development actors kind of enter the scene and say, I have this technology, like, let's figure out how I'm going to make it work for these people. I'm going to have a meeting with them and like, look, that's participatory development. When, I mean, as Ravi said, like one meeting is not going to, this happens in a long time horizon of partnership, and one meeting may actually represent the interests of the more dominant people in the community. One meeting, may happen under circumstances where the supposed beneficiary population is really afraid of losing access to the resources, so they'll say anything in order to retain access to the resources. But also, like, the other part of technocracy is like this whole framework that says I have this particular technology to deliver to you. Well, that already assumes that the priorities of this development project are set. So I would say kind of technocracy and short-term project-based interventions, and also the idea that like a single meeting constitutes participation, all of those are things that get in the way. I'd also just say that we need to think about participation much more broad, and the voice of the poor or the voice of the marginalized as including much more than just what people say in the context of meetings about how they should respond to a particular intervention. So I think there's an obvious place that we should be looking for, like the voices of the marginalized that development practitioners often forget about, which is social movements that are led by marginalized people. So I think it's really easy to say like participation just looks like what's happening in this meeting when we're deciding what to do about this like laser pointer intervention X or Y. But there are lots of other ways that marginalized people are communicating, what they care about and what their development priorities are. But that means that you have to like look outside of like the community meeting in order to find out what they are, right? So one kind of example that I think of about social movements around this is like the frequency with which Indigenous peoples movements are saying that they want something different from what development organizations are giving them. And like, they're not always saying that necessarily. Some of them are, of course, like in the meeting with the organization, but we also know, for example, like that, they're often saying that environmental degradation is like a cost that they don't want to bear, but you have to maybe look at what the social movements are saying in order to say that. Like, I think of this documentary called In the Name of Lithium about Indigenous people in Argentina that basically says like, well, the social movement is saying we don't want lithium mining here because we don't want to destroy our aquifers. Like, you might not ever know that this is a priority if you were just like, well, how are we going to make this lithium mining up? We have brought you this good of lithium mining. Let's talk about how to make it work together. Like, if that's your only framing and social movements aren't a part of the picture, you might actually miss some of the deeper things that communities are saying about what they want.
There is a scarcity everywhere of reliable and comprehensive empirical data about the plight of the marginalized and the vulnerable. What can be done about this gap? Serene, what are your thoughts?
I think that there are two very straightforward things that could be done here. One is just that there needs to be much more funding for the creation of expertise, like academic and technical expertise among people in the global South. And I think that means heavily funding think tanks, universities, academic research within the global South. And also, I think, equally importantly, funding the ability of this research to be disseminated within the global North. Because, of course, we have this really big problem that this is less of the case in India, for example, but people are writing in languages other than English, or they're writing in journals that are not accessible in the North or that nobody in the North reads. So we need not just to be providing a lot of funding for fostering expertise among scholars in the South, but we also need to be funding the institutions that allow the dissemination of information that's created in the South to flow to people in the global North. And this also goes to the issue of whether people in the global South already have a voice. There's certainly not enough funding for universities, think tanks, academic institutions, but people are creating knowledge sometimes, and then that knowledge is not actually effectively making it into the hands of people whose practices it could transform. So I think part of the story here is that a huge development priority should be putting money into universities, think tanks, and such in the global South, including ones that would enable people to speak back to dominant development discourses. Another kind of quick thing that I think is important is since this podcast is really aimed at practitioners, for people who are engaged in project-based interventions to be seeking and funding long-term external evaluations of the work that they're doing. So one of the real problems that we see in this field is that so much of the research about project effectiveness is conducted by donors and often by the people who implemented the project themselves. And this is worrisome for a bunch of reasons, but one of them is that it's unlikely that you are going to get honest feedback about the downsides of a program if you are the person who has implemented it. Even if you get the feedback, to go back to an earlier point, you might not even be able to really take the negative feedback in because you are so invested in your perception of yourself as helping these people. But you might not even get the negative feedback, especially because, and I think this is a really important point, people are afraid of losing the relationships or the resources that come from the intervention. So there's this, it's a little bit old now. I think it's from the late 1990s or the early 2000s, but there's a set of reports that I really like by the anthropologist Mark Friedrich about ActionAid's Reflect programs. So, a very Freirean, non-traditional type of development program. And what he finds about even that program is that, people are valuing the relationship with the development practitioner and the social capital it gives them in their community more than the actual product that the intervention is giving them. But so I think one thing we can take away from that that's really important to understand is we need methods for collecting data that separate the interests of keeping the relationship with the development practitioner from actually gathering the information. And then of course, I think it's important for research to always include methodologies where marginalized people participate in framing the questions that the research is asking, and where once the research has been created, they are asked for feedback about whether this research actually represents how they see the issue.
Thank you, Serene. And Ravi, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I echo everything that Serene has said. I also think that it's a very paradoxical situation, in fact, on data. On one hand, we have huge surveys, quantitative surveys happen at the national level, but we don't get subnational data, and that on a regular, continuous basis. So there's a clear need for creating means and resources to gather subnational data to allow a much greater disaggregation, which I was referring to in an earlier point. So that's one part of the story where we need consistent, high quality, subnational, disaggregated kind of data that can be used not only by the experts, by others for whom the data is meant for. So uh, getting that data and also making it less unwieldy is important aspect of data generation and data use. The other side of the story is that is something that relates to your earlier question of participation of people and their voices. And I think a lot of participatory work that happens, or the qualitative, so-called qualitative kind of work that happens on the ground, they are very they're kind of neo-positivist. They are reconfirming what you already know. It's kind of reaffirming yourself, revalidating what you want to do, rather than disrupting the system and the structures. So my sense is that on the issue of data, who is gathering data for what purpose is critical part of the story. We always will find funds if there are vested interests to gather some kind of data at many levels. But the data that is needed by the communities for their own use and for informing their own cases that they can advocate for, and you know in every aspects of life, whether disruption that's happening through climatic or environmental changes, or their own areas being they're being displaced, or the farms or the lands being taken away. Those data you don't get coming from the people and the communities.
Does pursuing inclusive development require us to seek more radical change to the distribution of power, such that equality and universal human dignity become more than just rhetorical concepts? Serene, could we start with you?
I I think the short answer to this is yes. I think like I was saying earlier, one of the important things about concepts like equality and equity is that they're relational concepts. Like the only way that we are going to achieve equality, because it's a certain kind of relationship between people, is not just by working on people at the bottom. We have to work on people at the top, right? Like part of why, and I take this to be part of Ravi's point about this permanent state of marginalization, like part of the reason that people at the bottom are at the bottom is because of the advantages disproportionately accruing to people at the top. So we have this really bad habit in development circles of acting like, oh, if we just work on people in the bottom, like, they get income, they get skills or something, like, then society will be transformed. But that's not necessarily true for a few different reasons. One reason is just that um, the part of the reason people at the bottom are stuck at the bottom is sometimes the behavior of people at the top, right? Like, I mean, it's not a coincidence that, I mean, just to give, an example from development, I mean, we live in this world where we think that, like, our model, this is a little bit of a cynical way of looking at it, but our model for women's empowerment is mostly like, oh, if we can just get enough women making handicrafts, like that people in the global north are going to buy and keep in their houses, like that is the way that we're going to solve global poverty. But it's like, but what about the bigger picture where our actual vision for what the world looks like is where some people are, like the majority of the world's people are going to live off providing occasional handicrafts for the very small percentage of people at the top. Like, this isn't a solution. Like, we have to get rid, like, we talk about getting rid of extreme poverty and we don't talk about getting rid of extreme wealth. Like, the second sort of reason that I think we have to talk about the relationship between the people on the top and the people at the bottom is not just that people at the top are preventing the people at the bottom from getting, being actually included into the benefits of development, but also that at the end of the day, if you have a lack of equality between people at the top and people at the bottom, like if that relationship is extreme enough, it's always going to produce domination of people at the bottom, right? So we can raise the floor of the poor, and I'm not saying that's not a good thing to do. Like, of course, we want people to have their basic needs met, but if the gap between the global rich and the global poor, or even the rich within the global south and the poor within the global south, remains as big as it is, well, we can expect the people at the top to continue dominating society and dominating political processes. Like, just the gap will do that. It doesn't matter if the people at the bottom have their basic needs met. If some people just have so much more than others, it's hard to imagine equitable political institutions in that kind of situation.
Thank you, Serene and Ravi.
I think there is a need, and that's what we have been discussing all through in response to all the five questions that you asked before this, that there is a need for a paradigm shift. I think there is. And what does this paradigm shift look like? To me, I think it is from coming from global south country and working within the communities that have such heavy, huge deprivations or lack of access to some of the basic stuff. Um, the very first point should be to enhance the access. We don't have schools that are accessible to the girls. There are no roads, there are no transportation facilities for 15 to 20 miles to go walking, or the cycles that are given to the girls, they are used by the men or the fathers because they don't have any other access to enhance their mobilities. So uh, access really gives, it promotes opportunities, and opportunities give rise to the agencies or the voices don't come in the first place, because when we say that they should ask for and they should participate, that's what we are saying, does not does not just come on its own. The agencies come only after they have access and they have the opportunities, and they begin to see themselves as an asset, not asset by someone who is in a powerful position to use them for some purposes, but the people begin to see themselves as an asset, and work towards that. And we have seen in programs of livelihood and employability kind of a program that we do at a small scale, that that the dire need, the desperate need to move in that direction by the girls, adolescent girls, late adolescent girls, who are fearing that if they don't get into a work stream, they would soon be married off. Yeah, so till but then how do they do this unless we shift completely from a perspective of enhancing act first, ensuring that they have access to the resources in some ways, and create those opportunities for them to widen their networking and resource access to resources, which they can use for themselves in to fulfill their aspiration. And that's where the agencies and voices then begin to shape. So I think a lot of it is about how structures, again I'm saying these are structural issues, and very often a lot of the programs that focus on participatory or taking people's voices into the programs, or work only on norms, which again put the responsibilities onto the individuals. They they clearly miss out the fact that we are not holding a larger policy and structural determinants of marginalization uh, that are not giving them even basic access. So and that's where I think it's a struggle within the development paradigm. We must have programs, we must have the interventions that are disruptive in nature. How often do we really disrupt? I mean, we are always smoothening the contours, in every which way. So nobody wants to push the others into a zone of discomfort, or boundaries of comfort is never pushed. And as a result, even the programs on norms, programs on economic empowerments, engaging men and boys, they don't they are least disruptive. The languages have been co-opted of gender transformative programming and gender transformative frameworks, but rarely do we see that these programs or these ideas.
As we come to the conclusion of the conversation, could you please share any closing thoughts with the audience that may emphasize certain ideas and concepts previously discussed or that we have yet to touch? Please.
That we need to have a gender lens that acknowledges that the men in those societies are often also victims of other type of marginalization. So we need to look at men as usually beneficiaries of elements of the gender system, but we also need to understand that the reasons that men may be feeding into those parts of the gender system are genuine vulnerabilities that they have because of issues like poverty and caste and so on.
Thank you, Serene. Please, Ravi.
One point that I have always kept in my mind when I engage in some of these programs that I work with and the communities is that to ensure that we see the disruptive and power of the development not in a destructive manner but in a manner that allows the points of introspections and confrontation in self-critical mode at every level. So how much of the critique these programs can generate is what we need to do as development practitioners. Um, we I also think that data is the most powerful tool to create that disruption and dissonance, and therefore development practitioners have a responsibility to generate the data responsibly with sense of accountability and with a sense of making sure that the data is used by the people for whom they are meant for. And I think we need to be theoretical sometime, not very often. A lot of the time, many development programs begin with a theoretical premise and theoretical framework, which is good, but um but we forget in the process of fulfilling or adhering or testing out those hypotheses that we have begun with, drawing from many other literature and the theories that there are that story the life unfolds differently in different context, and what needs to be done in development programs is to understand how life is unfolding and in its unnest, to understand what it means to the people and capture that process um, of lived experiences of people, and then try to situate development response into those lived experiences without disrupting them from their own places. I think a lot of development programs have literally moved people from one place to another. The displacement, migrations, and forced um, which mobility is again not very helpful in meeting the kind of outcomes that we are looking at. And that's what I said, that keep in mind that we are constantly either feeding into a humanitarian crisis or we are responding to them in a manner, but we don't recognize that. So I'll just my takeaways from from this conversation is this. Thank you.
I want to thank you on behalf of the Center for Values and International Development for your time and sharing your unique perspectives.
Thank you to you, Evan.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Serene, for such a pleasure.
This concludes the second of 5 conversations sponsored by the Center for Values and International Development. In addition to our first conversation introducing development ethics, we will also be exploring topics on democratic values, climate justice, and empowerment, all with the goal of strengthening the relationship between development practitioners and ethicists, because moral clarity matters.